This is an audio review of Chapter 2, Foundations of Criminal Justice Research for CRJU 340 Research Methods for Criminal Justice. Okay, so social scientific inquiry generates knowledge through logic and observation. Theory and observation go together in science, but sometimes theory precedes observation, and other times observation precedes theory. There are three key aspects of the overall scientific enterprise: theory, data collection, and data analysis. So when it comes to discovering what is, not what should be, we're trying to use methods to uncover what's going on, but we're not here to settle debates over the value or worth of certain topics or issues. It's really just to understand the social world around us so that we can, have policy alternatives or ideas of how to alleviate any of the kind of breakdown or problems that result from the system as it is. So the chapter also really starts looking at the issue of problematic evaluators. So when it comes to problematic evaluators, the example in the chapter is, how do we determine who is a good parole officer? Like, what measure do we use to determine how good someone is at their job, right? In this particular case, within the criminal justice system. So is it by how many people that they're supervising that return to prison, right? That could be one measure, but that could lead to unintended consequences. And that might not be an accurate measure of effectiveness, right? Such as if they have very few people violating parole, maybe it's because they're ignoring the parole violations, right? That's not a good parole officer. So by focusing on one specific criteria like low violation rates, we might make an error in assessment of the effectiveness of a parole officer. So this is to say that multiple measures would be better than one in this example, but also that we have to be careful about how we're evaluating things, what criteria we're using when we determine whether or not something is effective, right? Okay, so searching for patterns is really what social science aims to do, right? To find the patterns of regularity in social life so that we can make predictions about the future and about, the kind of world around us. So norms and rules really come from our society, right? And so if we're doing observation in society to understand social patterns, then we have to understand norms and rules, right? Because they create regularity in our culture. So an example from the chapter is how a person's not eligible for a driver's license until a certain age. That's a norm in the culture, right? We agree to these social notions, so they become our normal. And this does help organize society when we have agreed upon expectations and definitions. So social regularities represent probabilistic patterns. A general pattern does not have to be reflected 100% in the observable cases to be a pattern. It can be that something is more likely than not to happen. Or, for example, we know there are gender probabilities with crime, right? With men committing more violent crimes. It doesn't mean that women never or rarely commit violent crime. It just means from a statistical perspective, men are far more likely to engage in violent felonies than women. So that's what we mean by probabilistic patterns. It's not 100% of the time. It's not predictive. You can't say, well, these two people are at this crime scene and he's male and she's female, so therefore he's guilty, right? You have to actually use other factors to determine those things, right? But the probability is, when it comes to violent crime, when we look at the numbers from a macro perspective, that there is a strong statistical likelihood that violent crimes or violent felonies are committed by men, right? So we have to also remember, though, when we're looking at the averages and the overall larger macro figures, we're looking at aggregates, not individuals. So social scientists study social patterns, not individual ones. Sometimes we examine the experiences of the individual on a qualitative scale, but aggregates are much more often the subject of social science research, especially as it pertains to issues within the criminal justice system, as we pool our data together to look for larger patterns. So this distinguishes the activity of criminal justice researchers from daily routines of most criminal justice practitioners, because we're looking for the patterns, right? And so the book example is, if we want to see if white prisoners get better prison jobs than non-whites, we're aggregating people together and looking at the overall pattern, not at each individual. So some individuals might not fit that pattern, but that does not disprove the overall pattern, right? So if you're looking at the job assignments for white prisoners, if you look at overall they're getting better job assignments, then there is a probabilistic pattern there, right? But if you say, well, all but these three guys got worse, job assignments, that doesn't disprove the 97% of which that didn't. Does that make sense? So hopefully you understand the difference between something as 100% or, more probabilistic. So it's important to understand when we talk about aggregates that just because someone doesn't fall within the normal curve doesn't mean that the normal curve is wrong, basically, that sometimes we have experiences that are outliers. Sometimes our experiences go against the norm, but that doesn't disprove the social rule, right? Okay, so we'll talk a lot more about that later on. Okay, so variables and attributes. When we explore research to find out things about the world, we have to be open to the results and make larger understandings from the observations that we make in our research. So let's say you're looking at an individual and their particular criminal motivations. While that data might not be extrapolated to all people, it can provide us with some insight into what might be going on in the motivation for others to commit crimes. So even when we do look at or focus on the individual, we're still trying to fit that information into a larger social context, right? The body of knowledge that we can then contribute to in order to build more knowledge on any particular topic, whether it's why people commit crimes or how they define and see their own actions and motivations. So when we look at theory is written in variable language, and people and their thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors become parts of those variables, right? So we also have the difference, I guess I would say, between attributes and variables, even though they overlap a bit. Attributes are characteristics or qualities that describe some object, such as a person, right? So let's say being married or being single, right? That's one of the book examples of an attribute. Versus a variable would be a logical grouping of attributes. So let's say, grouping people by occupation, right? So what's interesting is when we go back to the difference between a variable and attribute. So if the variable is marital status, then the attribute would be the individual's response to that as married, if that makes sense, right? So the variable is the larger kind of logical grouping of attributes, meaning you would divide people among their marital status, right? This is something I'm sure you've seen in surveys before. When you filled out surveys, they'll ask you, or sometimes just other forms, they'll ask you, are you single? Are you divorced? Are you married? Are you widowed? Right? And so within a research study, we would use those things as variables to measure against some of the other findings that we have, right? To see if there's a difference between different kinds of people and how either, if this is the case, we're looking at what motivates them to commit crimes. These things can be valuable insights to give us better patterns that we can then use to predict future behavior of crime, right? So it's a little bit complicated, the whole attribute and variable thing, but really it's just the attribute would be the specific, right? So variable could be political party affiliation, and the attribute would be, being a Green Party candidate or something like that, right? Okay, so let's keep talking about this because I know these can be very confusing. So when we're looking at variables, we want to look at relationships the variables have with each other. So theories describe the relationship that might be logically expected to happen among these variables. And so that's why we have to test that and see if those relationships are occurring or if something else is at play. So and before we get into that, we have to talk a little bit about, correlation and causation. So causation is basically saying that one variable is causing a change in another or causing a reaction in another, versus a correlation is when two variables are related. So meaning a change or adjustment in one has an effect on the other. So it's difficult to prove causation, and we'll discuss this more in depth later, but really, it's basically saying that if this one variable, let's say, increases, then it causes a reaction within another variable, right? And we'll talk later about the specific directions of these relationships, because this is something you would want to discuss like within your research proposal, right? So let me give you a kind of benign example. One of the reasons that you're probably going to school is to get a degree because there's a correlation between level of education and yearly income, right? So what kind of correlation is that? It's a positive correlation. So what does that mean? It means that as one variable goes up, which is, let's say your level of education. So once you go from having an AA to a BA, that's a positive correlation. That when you go up in education level, you go up in income level, right? Now, what about if I was to say education level, or no, let's use income still. Let's go income level and its relationship with a variable like homelessness, right? If you look at that, there is still a relationship, but you would say as one variable increases, such as income level per year, the other variable decreases, homelessness, right? Because we know a lot of homelessness is caused by lack of affordable housing. So that would be a negative correlation, because as one thing increases, income, the other thing decreases, homelessness, right? So we're going to talk much more about this in depth later, but the idea is when we talk about variables, it's not enough to just say, I want to see how these relate. You're usually going to give a kind of predictive idea of how you think they're going to either correlate and what kind of direction you think that relationship will have, right? So is it as job training increases, then prison recidivism decreases, right? Is there a negative correlation? So those are the kind of things you have to be thinking about in regard to your own research topics, right? We're going to talk much more about how do you look at the relationships between the variables in your own research that you want to do. Okay, and then very briefly, you have the independent variable and the dependent variable, right? Something, again, we're going to talk about a whole bunch. But really the key difference is the independent variable is the one causing change, and the dependent variable is the one being affected by the changes in the independent variable. So an example of this kind of independent variable, dependent variable that comes from the chapter would be the type of defense attorney you have having an impact on whether you get prison or probation, right? So what would be the independent variable and what would be the dependent variable in that relationship, right? Well, in this case, it's going to be the type of defense attorney you have is going to impact whether you end up on probation or in prison. And we know, of course, when it comes to the criminal justice system, having legal representation has a lot to do with how much money you have and what kind of counsel you're able to get. So we know that rich people are able to get a lot better counsel, right? So think about that. The type of defense attorney you have, that's going to be your independent variable, because that would cause a difference in your dependent variable, whether you end up in prison or whether you end up on probation, right? So we'll talk much more about many other examples so that this becomes very clear. I know that can be really confusing for people, the independent and dependent variable, but really it's just which one is causing the change, right, is the independent, and the dependent is the one that's being affected or depends upon the independent variable. Okay, so different avenues for inquiry. We have idiographic explanations, and this is when we attempt to explain a single situation exhaustively. So we want to fully understand the cause of what's happening in one particular instance and, comprehensively explain that one case, right? Again, why? Why would we want to explain that so well? Well, that way we can kind of extrapolate some, meanings from it that we can theoretically apply in a larger scale, right? Nomothetic explanations, on the other hand, seek to explain a class of situations or events rather than a single one. So they want to explain efficiently and, they're settling for partial explanation. So these relate very closely to the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning, or really the difference between a qualitative and a quantitative approach. So deductive reasoning goes from general to specific, So when you're moving from general to specific, you're basically saying, okay, here's the kind of overall topic I'm looking at, and here's the specific variables and their relationship that I'm going to test, right? And this comes from a logically or a theoretically expected pattern that is going to be tested by the researcher. So that means it's coming from the theory first, right? So they're also looking for why something happens, not necessarily whether it's happening, but why it's happening, right? Versus inductive reasoning is kind of the flip side of this. It goes from the specific to the general. So they're going to go from a set of observations first to discovering a pattern among the observations and then applying theory to interpret the patterns. So think about it this way. For deductive, you're going to start with a theory, and the theory says, hey, this is how things work. So you're going to develop a hypothesis based on that theory, and then you're going to test whether or not that hypothesis comes true, basically, or is demonstrated within your data. While in inductive, you might be looking at a more idiographic explanation, right? You might be looking at a much smaller set of people. Maybe you're only doing, let's say, interviews with 10 people, right, about their particular criminal behavioral patterns or something like that. And it's from those observations or interviews or, the specific methodology of how you collect the data, you start to form patterns from what you see represented in their responses, and then you kind of you use theory to interpret those patterns, right? So it's basically two sides of the same coin when it comes to deductive or inductive. There's not a right or wrong. A lot of this is really determined by what kind of research question you have. Leading your analysis is often going to determine the kind of methodology you choose, which then, of course, determines this avenue of inquiry that you're going to make, whether you're going deductive or inductive. So like I said, deductive, inductive are like hand in hand with qualitative, quantitative. So when it comes to qualitative, this just means non-numerical data, right? So non-numerical meaning often with a greater richness of meaning. So this could be a lot of different qualitative methods, and we'll talk much more about qualitative methods in the future as well, but qualitative methods that are common would be, like I just mentioned before, interviews, maybe observation, participant observation, or, very famously ethnography, which is something that, I find incredibly helpful. So there are, many examples I'm going to incorporate into the class based on ethnographies that I find fascinating, largely because an ethnography is very difficult to replicate because of the time spent in the field. And it might still be a very, kind of narrow, again, starting from a specific and moving to the general, but they can provide information that other research just cannot do because it doesn't have the depth to get into those things, right? So one example could be there's this very handsome, well, I guess you don't need to know he's handsome, but he really is, professor. I'll just not tell you what university he's out of, that's fine. Otherwise you'll Google it and you'll be like, oh yeah, I know who she's talking about. But anyway, let's just say in a Midwestern prestigious college, that he did this research on Skid Row and the way in which the populations of Skid Row interact with police and the kind of system of policing that they come up against within that realm of Skid Row, of course, in LA, right? In downtown LA. And so he wanted to kind of understand what was their daily life experiences, how were these interactions taking place, stuff like that, right? So he spent 2 years every day on Skid Row to kind of get an insight that most researchers would not get from going down there once in a while, or from just interviewing people or talking to them in those ways, right? This is kind of the strength of ethnography, is it provides information that can be difficult to gain if you're not an insider. So part of ethnography, especially participant observation, is kind of becoming an insider so that you can understand the social world that you're studying so that you can gain insights from it, right? So anyway, he's sitting there in Skid Row for years, and he notices this really interesting phenomenon, right? So I'm sure you've all heard of the concept of being streetwise, right? The idea that if you are in a dangerous environment, you have to project a sense of toughness in order to kind of create a barrier of protection for yourself against being victimized by other people within that neighborhood, right? So people will kind of bluster, they really puff out their chest when they walk, right? They're kind of, physically big and commanding and strong and trying to project an image of toughness, right? But what he also noticed was that when police would turn down the street and someone was performing this streetwise performance, all of a sudden they would deflate, they would shrink, or they'd start like dragging a leg behind them as if they were infirm, right? And the reason for this that he started to come up with, as we'll talk about in a second, he basically saw this pattern happening over and over. So he tried to develop meaning about what was happening with this pattern based on the theory, right? So this kind of very, inductive, qualitative approach. And what he came up with was a new theoretical way of understanding what people were experiencing. So he wanted to know, why are people deflating? Why are they acting less tough when they see the cops, right? And what he found out from talking to people, from all these observations over time, is that in order to avoid police scrutiny or being, potentially detained, harassed, stopped, searched, there was this kind of technique that people in the neighborhood of Skid Row would use, which he then called being cop-wise. So not just being streetwise, but being cop-wise. So meaning, if you see, a police officer turn onto your street and you're presenting yourself as streetwise and tough, that can actually make you a target for police. That can put a target on your back because now you look like a criminal element. You look like someone that might be, maybe deviant in some way. But ironically, a lot of people take on that persona in order to just keep themselves protected from violence that they might encourage us from living in the very dangerous environment like Skid Row. But the fact that they were able to so fluidly switch from streetwise to copwise, kind of demonstrated the need for that extra layer of insular protection for people in these neighborhoods. So that's just kind of one example of an ethnography that he wouldn't know those things. We wouldn't know those things either. And again, we don't know if that's true outside of the confines of Skid Row within those couple years he was studying it. But that's kind of the whole point of ethnography is, it might not be happening in every place everywhere, but it can give us insight into how people are kind of, within their own bodies reacting to what they perceive to be pressures or threats within their social environment. So, that's kind of just one example, and I'm going to give you like a million other ethnographic examples because honestly, some of the criminological ethnographies are my favorite. They're fascinating, and my mentor wrote one, so I'm going to work that one in a few times too. Okay, so quantitative is the one that everyone's afraid of in a research methods class. It's the numerical data. So this is, again, stats, statistical measures is quantitative, right? So if you think about it, the kind of data collection that you have to do to produce quantitative data is something that can be turned into a numerical form. So you have to kind of keep that in mind too if you want to do something more quantitative in scope. You have to think, well, what methodology can you choose that can represent its results within a numerical data? So something we're going to do in this class is a survey, right? You're going to draft one, you're going to make one. And the way that survey data works, especially I'm sure many of you have had to take a survey. It's pretty standard nowadays, mostly because they're cheap and easy to make. And the way that it works often is what's called a Likert scale. So this means that you're going to have scores like strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree, or something like that on that kind of scale. And it's called a Likert scale. And the idea of a Likert scale is you would assign differing point values based on what you're trying to measure, right? So let's say you're trying to measure, people's attitudes towards prison reform, right? Then people who strongly agree with prison reform, maybe that's a number 1, right? They get a 1 as a numerical data representing their point value, right? So you give a point value to their answers. So you would assign strongly agree, number 1, disagree, or sorry, strongly disagree, 1, disagree, 2, neutral, 3, agree, 4, and strongly agree, 5. And the idea is, if you have a bunch of questions that are using that similar scale, let's say you have, 5 questions, then the lowest point value you could have is 5, and the highest point value you could have is 25. So people that are at like 20 or more are in high support of, prison reform, versus people that are somewhere between 5 points and 10 points are at low support for prison reform. So that's the way that we're able to turn someone's opinion on a survey into numerical data. And that's one example, but there's many, many other methods that also net numerical data. And again, it's really just the kind of scope of what you're looking at. Are you looking at a small scale group of people that you want to apply some theory to understand the patterns? Or for a quantitative approach, are you testing a hypothesis? Are you trying to see a specific relationship between variables that you can then see if it's statistically significant or not, right? So how do you choose? Well, both are useful and legitimate. So you choose based on your topic, or sometimes people combine aspects of both in a more mixed methods approach, so you don't even have to say one or the other. But especially for the purpose of our class, you usually want to pick one or the other so you don't have to write as lengthy a methods section. Okay, so some terms in theory construction. So theory is systematic explanation for the observed facts and laws that relate to a particular aspect of life. So these are propositions explaining why events occur in the manner that they do. Objectivity, which is the goal, is often called independence of the mind. So meaning we want research to be conducted without impact from our belief systems, from our bias, to make its way into the research, right? So if a lot of us agree on something, that it exists, we treat it as objective. But oftentimes, because of our culture is so incredibly subjective, it can be easy to be fooled by things, meaning sometimes the norms and the expectations we have in the culture of things that are quote unquote always that way, or we all know it to be that fact, sometimes those things are wrong. And that's why we need to use systematic research methods, not just because sometimes our assumptions are wrong, but also society is dynamic. It changes. So what might have been true 50 years ago in relation to crime might be completely different now because a lot of social factors have changed, right? So the goal of using structured research methods, though, is to have more objectivity in how you study something so that you can know that your findings have a particular relevance. Okay, so again, subjectivity is the opposite of objectivity. Just want to briefly put that out there. Subjectivity are our perceptions or beliefs or opinions. Okay, so a hypothesis are just specific expectations about an empirical reality derived from propositions. So what do you think is going to happen? And this is kind of like, the way I see it is, you pose a research question. I want to see, what is the relationship between, let's say, having prison training programs and any effect that might have on recidivism, right? Or the likelihood of someone to come back to prison within a short period of time after leaving. So you could make a hypothesis based on the propositions. And the hypothesis could be something like, you assume that as prison programs are implemented, that would lower the recidivism rate, right? So that there would be a negative correlation between the two. That as prison programs increase, the amount of people ending up back in jail after being released goes down, right? So that could be your hypothesis based on what the theory tells you is likely the case. And then you test that hypothesis in a specific case to see if that's true. Like, that might be the overall truth, but maybe there's one program that they're using that isn't particularly effective, right? And as a result, you're not seeing the relationship that you think you're seeing. So we can't just set out thinking we already know how the world works. We have to always question and be open to the results of that research. So the difference between, you hear theories and paradigms and all this stuff. Basically, a paradigm is a model or scheme that organizes a view of something. So it's really a lens through which we look at the world. It's structured like theories are, but it's much broader, right? A way of viewing things that affects how we understand or approach research problems. So basically, a paradigm is usually an umbrella that has many theories under it, right? So for, criminology, for example, there are many different schools of thought and different kinds of criminological theories, but they all fall under one paradigm or one banner of criminological theories. But each one has different terminology, has different assertions, and oftentimes conflicting ideas about the kind of things that we're trying to study. So the paradigm are the larger kind of organization of oftentimes many theories that kind of fit into a scope of kind of similar based arguments or similar approaches to a particular topic. Okay, so moving on to the traditional model of science, you got three main elements. I talked about this a little bit in chapter 1. You got conceptualization, which is when scientists use theory to develop research questions that can be examined through observation of some kind, or that data collection you do. Operationalization are the specification of the steps, procedures, and operations that you would use to identify and measure your variables. Right, so this is something I kind of touched upon a little bit in chapter 1. It's the idea that you conceptualize a research study. So you want to see, again, the idea of if a program is reducing recidivism, then you have to actually operationalize that, meaning how are you going to measure whether or not it's actually effective, right? So again, this is where you specify the steps you take, the procedures you would take, how you would identify these and measure those variables. So, because this is, again, a very important part of research, because research needs to be replicable. So you need to be very specific in how you would do your own research study, so that if I come and look at your research findings and I want to replicate the study to see the veracity of the results, then I know how you specified your variables. Because think about some of the social variables we would use, like, let's say crime, right? How do you define crime? I'm sure every single one of us in this class could come up with a definition that's slightly different. So we have to specify how we either define, identify, and how we plan to measure the variables that we're using in our research, right? And then observation is looking at the world systematically and developing theoretical expectations. And of course, measuring the data. The observation is kind of how we do all of it, whether it's literally observation or participant observation, or again, if it's observing people through their data in a survey, or again, all of these kind of other things. Sometimes observation could be using existing research, right? So those are the main elements of how research studies are done. First, you come up with the concepts, then you figure out how to measure them, and then you actually observe the stuff, right? So an example from the book, they talk about the Sean McKay concentric zones, which normally I would draw this on the board, but I think you can guess how this works if you've ever seen a bullseye. So basically, Sean McKay, just a little backstory on them, they came out of the Chicago School of Criminology, which again is called that because it was so closely related to the University of Chicago. And so they proposed a framework that began with the assumption that certain neighborhoods in all cities have more crime than in other parts of the city. Most of them located in this kind of zone 2, which, basically not the innermost zone, but the next zone. So think of it as, again, a kind of bullseye, right? Except for this bullseye has several circles in it. And so basically they saw it as cities having, kind of rings that are formed from the inside out. And if you think of the inner ring as zone 1, the next ring is zone 2, the next one is zone 3, zone 4, etc., they were basically trying to study the cities within the scope of zones in order to understand what was going on and why crime was happening in certain areas, right? So the zone 2, which isn't the innermost, but the second innermost zone, was the one that was the most in transition between residential and industrial areas due to, and of course, when they were doing this research, it was more because of factories coming in. Later, we'll talk about the consequences in these same neighborhoods of factories leaving due to globalization and, all sorts of other stuff in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But anyway, according to Sean McKay, the neighborhoods that have the highest rates of crime typically have at least 3 common problems in the area: physical dilapidation, poverty, and heterogeneity, which is a nice way of saying a mix of different cultural minorities, right? I guess it isn't really that nice when you really think about it. But anyway, there were other common characteristics of these neighborhoods, such as high transient populations, as well as high unemployment among residents of the neighborhood. So it's predicted that the antecedent, right, that factors of poverty, heterogeneity, and physical dilapidation lead to a state of social disorganization. And the social disorganization is what turns to crime and delinquency. So one of the most significant contributions of Sean McKay's model was that they demonstrated the prevalence and frequency of various social ills, be it poverty, disease, low birth weight, etc., tend to overlap with high delinquency rates. Regardless of what social problem is measured, higher rates of social problems are almost always clustered in the zone of transition, right? And so it was in this area that Shaw and McKay believed there was a breakdown in informal social controls. So they hypothesized that children begin to learn offending norms from interactions with peers on the street through what they call play activities. So the breakdown in the conditions of the neighborhood lead to social disorganization, which again, in turn, leads to delinquents, kind of children becoming delinquents and learning criminal activities from older youth in the neighborhood. So one of the best things about Sean McKay's theoretical model is they supply data to support their propositions. That's a huge thing that we love, is when people don't just make assertions, they show some data to try and back this up. So they demonstrated data, again, using existing research, so in this case, data from the U.S. Census and city records, that neighborhoods that had high rates of poverty, physical dilapidation, and high cultural mix were neighborhoods that had the highest rates of delinquency and crime. So the high rates of delinquency and other social problems were consistent with this framework of concentric circles, in that the highest rates were observed in Zone 2. However, there's an exception to the model, right? There were certain places that this research was done that just did not fit. So we have to acknowledge when there's flaws or weaknesses, or sometimes it's not completely applicable as a theory, right? So the Gold Coast area in the northern coast of Lake Michigan was notably absent from the high rates of social problems, particularly delinquency, that existed throughout otherwise consistent model of concentric circles. So there was exceptions to the research when they were doing this. Also, Sean McKay's longitudinal data showed that it didn't matter which ethnic group lived in Zone 2, because all groups, with the exception of Asian Americans, that lived in Zone 2 had higher delinquency rates while they lived there. So once most of each ethnic group moved out of Zone 2, their delinquency rates decreased significantly. So this finding rejects the notions of social Darwinism that were very popular at the time before, these arguments, or before their theories became more widespread, because it's obvious that it's not just culture that influences crime and delinquency, but in Shaw and McKay's argument, it's also the criminogenic nature of the environment that you're in, right? If you're in a social environment that's in transition, that has a lot of problems with poverty and all these things, that can actually, lead to more crime and delinquency. So the social environment is also important, right? So again, that's just, kind of one example of using these research methods to kind of make predictions about the world and really try and find patterns that we can then explore to understand the way that things work better. So of course, from Sean McKay, we'll talk about this later, but obviously there were policy implications to this kind of stuff, right? If you're saying it's the way that cities are designed, then you can design them different in order to hopefully alleviate some of those issues of crime. Okay, so switching to quickly in activity. So this is just to kind of reinforce what we're talking about with inductive and deductive research, right? So I want you to list what the correct order is and represent this graphically for hypothesis, data, and theory, whether it's deductive or inductive. So where does each one start and end, right? Where does deductive start? Does it start with hypothesis, data, or theory? Which comes second? Which is last? And with inductive, where does it start? Does it start with hypothesis, data, or theory? Right? What's the middle process and what is the end result? So I just want you to, and again, you're like, why are you making me do this? I just want to take a second. This isn't something you have to turn in. This is really just something for your own notes and really to reinforce the kind of concept, because I know some of us are more visual learners, and oftentimes just taking the time to reflect and actually physically make something can really help cement this process into your brain. And especially deductive and inductive are really important to understand because they're so closely related to qualitative and quantitative that we're going to keep talking about. So what I want you to do is just write down, maybe on a piece of paper, on one end of the paper, deductive, and on the other, inductive, or maybe on the other side of the same paper, depending on how big you're planning on drawing this. And what I want you to do is draw some graphic example of the relationship between these things. So deductive, where do you start? Do you start with theory? Do you start with data? Or do you start with your hypothesis? What comes second and what comes third? So I want you to it could be in a list format, this could be little bubbles with an arrow, whatever is a graphic way that you can represent this. I'm going to give you a little bit of time here, or if you need more time, you can just kind of pause this so that you have plenty of time to go through this exercise. But I just want to take a quick second here to give you this opportunity to draw the relationships between the two. Okay, how'd you do? Did you draw something? Was that too quick? Well, if you're on Jeopardy, that's all the time you would have, right? So let's jump into, a little wrap up here. Okay. So if this is my graphic representation, one starts first, then the next, then the next, which approach is this? Which approach do you start with data? Do you develop a hypothesis? And then you develop theory? That's going to be the inductive approach. Correct. Yay. No, I'm just kidding. You guys are all answering all at once, I'm sure, yelling at your computers. Okay, so what if I switch these two, right? Or what if I'm looking at starting with theory, developing a hypothesis, and then the result being data? Then you're looking at the deductive approach. And again, why did I make you do this? Because I think it's important to understand the mechanisms of it, because I know a lot of people said that they expressed some anxiety about taking a class like a research methods class. And I think the easiest way to get past the anxiety is to make the terminology that can be confusing super common and understandable, right? So this is why I forced you to do this. Okay, let's go right back into it. So again, deductive is when you go from general to specific. Inductive is when you go from specific to general, or sometimes in inductive we call this grounded theory. So let me give you an example, and again, I apologize for incorporating sociology, but here we go. I'm going to give you an example from a very famous sociologist named Durkheim, and he was trying to establish sociology and show that you could study even the most personal things from a societal scope. So in this case, he decided to study suicide, which is a very personal decision. And he looked at it with systematic research methods and was able to find patterns and refine theory. So he started with a deductive approach. So what does that mean? Well, he tested the established theory of the day, which at the time was that people commit suicide if they're insane. So he developed his hypothesis based on that theory. And so he had certain specifics. And again, the specifics are very time specific to the bias of the time period, right? So he had a hypothesis that women would commit more suicide than men because women were considered crazy, right? This is the yellow wallpaper time period where they lock people up for hysteria. And again, fun fact about hysteria that I will leave out of this, but feel free to ask me later. Anyway, he also thought that some religious groups would be more likely than others to commit suicide. In this case, he, based on the theories, thought that people of the Jewish faith would be more likely to commit suicide. And, basically he set out to test these hypotheses based on the theory that was predominant at the time. And so when he looked at the data, he disproved the theory that crazy people killed themselves more. He found that men commit more suicide than women, and that people of Jewish faith were actually the least likely of the religious groups that he examined to commit suicide. So then he gave up on life completely. No, of course not. He then just turned to a more inductive approach, right? Deductive didn't work for him. He used the existing theory, he tested it, but he didn't find what he thought he was going to find. So he moved on to an inductive approach instead. So he started, instead of starting with the existing theory, he looked at data on suicide to see if he could find any patterns that popped out of the data. So he found that those who were married or those who had children were less likely to commit suicide, and that Catholics were less likely than Protestants. So he developed a new theory based on those patterns and argued with those that had weaker social ties were more likely to commit suicide, right? So meaning someone who's not married, someone who doesn't have kids, because we all know that we all go through stuff in life, and sometimes the real key difference is whether or not you have someone who cares, that listens to you and supports you. So that's kind of what he found in relation to suicide. So that's just one example of how even within one research study, you could be doing a deductive and an inductive approach. It's just where you start and where you end that determines if it's deductive or inductive. So there's no right or wrong. The book also has the example of the role of race within police decision-making. So the chapter goes super in depth into examples of these processes of induction and deduction through various examples in the criminal justice system, including the analysis of race and police decision-making. Specifically as it pertains to police having discretion. And again, since this chapter spends several pages on this, I'm just going to quickly say that we have to examine whether or not there's an issue of bias when a disproportionate amount of people of color end up incarcerated. But as we'll talk about later, there are various factors that contribute to this. And an unfortunate one is bias on the part of police. But again, we're talking about aggregates, not individuals. It's not about one particular cop's behavior, as many cops are not prejudicial or biased against minorities, but some are. And it's important to understand the scope of these issues so we can guard against bias and produce more equitable outcomes. So we can see this issue when we look at police gangs, such as the executioners in the LA County Sheriff's Department. Earlier in 2021, Sean Kennedy of Loyola Law School from the Center of Juvenile Law and Policy detailed the existence of 18 distinct police gangs within the LA Sheriff's Department and found evidence of their presence as far back as 1971. The report says that one of the gangs, the Executioners, which operated in Compton, would hold celebrations at bars after an officer shot somebody. After they were admitted to the gang, then an officer would receive a tattoo, which is a skull with a Nazi-style helmet. And this is a quote from the report. Some of these subgroups have tattoos, hand signals, and rituals that are similar to a criminal street gang, says the report. The concern is that these subgroups foster a culture that resists police reforms, such as community policing and constitutional policing, by encouraging and even celebrating aggressive tactics and excessive use of force against minority communities. So that's from the report itself. So the author of the report, Kennedy, says he believes that young male officers might be drawn into a police gang for the same reasons that others might join a street gang: camaraderie, a sense of place, and the benefits of protection. And another part of Kennedy's 50-page report talks about how the Sheriff's Department even structured settlements to victims to hide the existence of these gangs from the public because they didn't want the scrutiny and the oversight. So obviously this is a big issue in a time when we're discussing reforms. And again, it's not about, oh, well, I know this particular officer and he has the best intentions. And it's like, well, that's great. But the problem is when you have the documentable existence of literal gangs within the police department, we have to understand the scope of those things. It's not anti-police to research and try to understand so that we can reform the system to be not just more efficient, but more equitable. So also, it literally talks about this for like half a second in the in the chapter, is the idea of field research and survey research. So because we're going to talk about each one of them individually, so it's fine that we don't go into it super in depth today. But field research is typically just meaning in the field when you're out there within a particular social group or environment trying to understand what's going on or what the mechanisms of that area are. So that example I gave you before of, the ethnography within Skid Row, that would be field research of going into a field, in this case Skid Row, and trying to understand the kind of criminal developments and really just the way in which people have certain social roles that are specific to that social environment, right? While survey research, you're still developing theories and information from the observations, but the observation in a survey research is basically what the results were that people said. So what it even means to observe something is very specific to the specific, methodology that you choose to apply to your own research topic. So crime is a social problem, right? And research is driven by theory that is then linked to public policy. Theory structures research, which then, of course, develops policy. So research guides the way in which the government and the public respond to crime. This is why it's important that we have validity, both internal and external validity, in our research so that we're having results that are actually applicable. Otherwise, the consequences can be very negative if people are developing policy based on flawed research, right? Or research that isn't peer-reviewed or has that kind of support to know that there's some validity there. So policies are often in the form of if-then statements and are subject to empirical tests to see if their logic actually bears out in the data that's collected. Meaning, if this happens, then that happens, kind of policies. And the problem with this, too, is that sometimes between the research level and the policy level, some of the specifics of the research get either whittled away or watered down. And so it's integral in these days and times that we're able to accurately represent what the research is saying and not use one figure or part of the results and, kind of apply a heftier meaning or weight to it than is actually there. So they give a couple examples of this in the book of the kind of rush to policy when we don't have enough data to support what we're finding within maybe one research study. And again, the last thing we want to do is cause more harm than good. So we want to provide research that, sometimes it takes a little longer to have it peer reviewed, to have it replicated, all those kind of things. But we want to make sure that if the research we're doing is informing policy decisions, that we're not making policy based on research that isn't necessarily accurately representing what's going on, or if it's biased and it doesn't have the kind of objectivity that's needed. Or this is another thing we'll talk about too. When research is not done in a purely research capacity, right? Sometimes there are vested interests in finding out results, meaning there are, corporate entities or private entities that pay for research to be conducted. And oftentimes they're looking for a specific result. And that's not what we do when we're actually doing real research, right? Real research is about finding out the results, and that's the results. Some of these other more troubling research is funded by certain interests, and they're looking for a particular result so that they can strike policy. And this is why it's important for all of us, whether or not we're planning on going to graduate school or doing research ourselves, to be more critical consumers of research so that we can see some of the things that either don't logically add up or some of the pitfalls, or really understanding the weight of results so that we're not as easily duped or misled or misinformed. And especially because if the policy that's based on these things is flawed, that can have all sorts of other unintended consequences that we haven't predicted because of a confusion within that particular research. On the flip side of that, though, we don't just make research to pat ourselves on the back and say, hey, look, we know that what these issues with crime are. We do it so that there can be some applicable changes. So I understand the rush to apply policies, but as we've seen through like the 90s crime bill and other things that we look back in the past and we can see it with that vision of understanding the kind of flaws, sometimes when you're in those moments, it's a lot harder to see that. And so that's why we have to work, diligently to question research results, to look specifically at the methodology of research. Because even if the results agree with what we think they will be, we have to be critical. Okay, so let's move on to criminological evolution. Okay, this one's super brief, and we're definitely going to go much more into a lot of these different topics later on, but just a little mini version of this, right? So criminological evolution maintains that behavior is affected by environmental forces. So it matters the context in which people are in. And so this is kind of course, what differentiates from something like psychology that's looking at the individual's psyche or their own personal motivations in their brain. We're looking at these things in a criminological way. We're looking at the environmental forces that also impact people's, decision making and really what opportunity structures they have to make decisions within. So, just like the research that we talked about before, often criminological evolution has linked urban design, human behavior, and crime. So like the urban transition zones, where the physical environment, can affect the likelihood of crime. So if you're living in crowded housing, you have a very unpleasant social environment filled with poverty, then that could affect your likelihood to commit crime. So research like the Shaw and McKay research on concentric zones affected the thinking of architects and city planners, which led to Newman's book Defensible Space, where Newman argued that urban housing should be constructed to enhance residents' ability to monitor and control their environment. So what comes out of this is this process called CPTED, or crime prevention through environmental design. So we have to understand in which, like the zones that Shaw and McKay were discussing, that it didn't matter who lived in Zone 2, ethnic-wise. It was the poverty and the conditions of the environment that cause more crime. So this is an important factor, especially because so many theories in the past were biased by racism, by sexism, by all sorts of isms. And there were a lot of kind of culture of poverty arguments and arguments that if people of color are ending up in prison more, it must be because they're just more criminal. And we know when looking at criminological theories, that's just not the case. That's an extreme oversimplification of what's going on. So we're going to talk more about this evolution later on and dive deeper into the more specifics of these different criminological theories and approaches that kind of developed over time as our understandings developed and changed. Okay, so there's also the ecological theories. So this, the kind of crime prevention through environmental design led to the development of situational crime prevention as a policy measure. So situational crime prevention is directed at highly specific forms of crime. It involves the management, design, and manipulation of the immediate environment to increase effort and risk of crime, to reduce the perceived reward, and remove excuses and justifications. So one example is the prevention of auto theft or vandalism in parking lots. The basic idea is that the more time and effort it takes to steal a car or vandalize a car, the less people will try to do it, right? Especially when it comes to stealing cars. So think about the ways we can reduce the risk of car thefts. There's so many ways, with cameras, or you can have one of those face plates on your car stereo that comes off so people can't steal the whole car stereo, which obviously deters the kind of value of stealing that. Or there's those weird wheel locks like the club, right? Or even the layout of a parking lot itself, right? The design of the parking lot can reduce auto theft. So I'm trying to keep this audio brief, but the book does go much more in depth and demonstrates how both the deductive and inductive approaches were used in the research to better understand the dimensions of the issues to develop strategies to alleviate car thefts. And we'll talk about more examples of situational crime prevention in the future, as it is often important to specify a certain kind of crime and look at the dimensions of that crime independent of other crimes in order to understand the social mechanisms that are motivating that particular issue, right? So sometimes if we look at crime as a broad measure, that can give us a scope of what's going on in society. But also using something like situational crime prevention can use application of one particular specific form of crime that can be alleviated through different techniques or strategies that, of course, are coming from different kinds of research, both the deductive, testing the theories that we already have, and the inductive, doing a more grounded theory approach and developing new theories to understand as we change society and as, the world progresses, how do the dimensions of these kind of crimes change, and how can we change our approach in order to not just alleviate or punish crime, but really to prevent it from happening in the first place.